Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. A loud honk sounded as the car in front of me suddenly came to a stop. Something had raced across the road, something big. I slammed on the brakes and prayed that the icy road would not allow for another dent. It was hard to make out any shapes through the dense veil of the jarring symphony of the snowstorm, but I could tell that whatever had crossed the highway had done so with speed and precision. Maybe a moose, I thought, and paid it no further mind. I leaned back in my seat and turned up the volume of the radio. Frank Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon" filled the cozy interior of my SUV, and I felt my heartbeat gradually stabilize. It had been several hours since I had left my hometown, and already I was surrounded by an endless expanse of white as far as the eye could see. On both sides of the highway, I should have seen a forest, but due to the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions, it was impossible to see anything beyond 10 feet. As I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel in perfect time with the song, I became increasingly impatient. We had been stuck for at least 5 minutes now. There couldn't possibly be that much traffic out here. The song was almost over, and we still hadn't moved. Behind me, I heard an aggressive honking concert. Behind me were at least 6 cars, and as far as I could tell, probably 6 in front of me as well. Their headlights were the only sign of their existence, as the snow had made everything else invisible. Then, like wildfire, a troubling thought spread through the crevices of my mind. Was there an accident? I sat up and somehow tried to peer over the car in front of me. It was pointless. "What's going on here?" I murmured softly as a loud sigh escaped my body. The howling wind outside slammed violently against the outside of the car, obliterating any thoughts of getting out and checking. At the moment, it was probably best to just wait. It would surely be over in a minute or so. I took my phone and fiddled around with a few apps. Well, I'm not a fan of texting while driving, but since we haven't been driving for a while, a short social media session wouldn't hurt anyone. Besides, it didn't look like I was going anywhere anytime soon. I even glanced at the half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels, modestly resting on the floorboard of the seat next to me, but I decided against it for the time being. Before this traffic jam, I had visited my extended family in my hometown over the holidays. For reasons we don't need to go into, I was forced to leave earlier than originally expected. That was fine with me, as I couldn't bear another second of the gossipy family drama and the terrible holiday atmosphere. Forgive me for withholding the details, but for privacy reasons, I will not disclose the name of the city I departed from or my current travel destination. You just need to know that the road I was on was pretty far up in the northwest, and that it was absolutely icy. Some time passed, and the vehicles on the road hadn't moved an inch. It was as if they were stuck to the icy ground. With horror, I watched as the car in front of me was being swallowed by the rapidly growing snowfall. The tires of the car were almost completely snowed in, and I thought it wouldn't be long before I wouldn't even be able to make it home in time to watch today's football game. Then I heard sirens in the distance. I looked up from my phone, directed my gaze to the side mirror, and saw a faint blue flashing light cutting through the snowstorm. The ambulance raced past me at breakneck speed, and shortly after, a police car followed. This only confirmed my suspicion that something terrible must have happened. I scrolled through my phone and continued as usual, although my digital efforts would prove to be quite fruitless. The longer I used my phone, the worse the connection seemed to get. TikTok and YouTube videos started to buffer, and other apps that required an internet connection wouldn't even load. I am by no means a physicist, technician, or meteorologist, or whatever the appropriate title would be, but I suspected that the ongoing storm might be related to the problems with my phone signal. Coincidentally, I was also in the middle of nowhere, 40 minutes from the nearest settlement and 3 hours from the nearest city. The remoteness of my location would certainly affect my connection as well. A light tapping on the window surprised me, and I jumped in my seat. At least I thought so, when the sight of a burly police officer on the other side of the glass greeted me. As it turned out, he had been outside in the storm for far too long. His cheeks were rosy, and snowflakes were stuck in his bushy mustache. I quickly put my phone in my pocket, rolled down the window, and prepared to explain why I was on the phone in traffic. But none of that interested the police officer. "Good evening," began the police officer. "There was an incident further up the street. At the moment we're trying. Could you turn that down?" He pointed at the radio. Of course, excuse me," I replied and turned the scroll wheel of the volume button all the way down. "As I said, we are trying to evacuate this entire area. As soon as I have reached the last car at the end behind you and have brought it to reverse, I want you to follow it immediately." "You want me to back in?" I asked with a questioning expression. "The road is too narrow. At the moment, I see no other option unless you want to try turning around and risk ending up in one of these ditches here," said the policeman with a slight grin. But before I had the chance to say anything, a thunderous bang erupted a few meters in front of us. The wind carried the sound with terrifying precision. The police officer reacted immediately by swinging his hand over the pistol in his holster. He took a few steps back and tried to radio through his shoulder-mounted device. Another bang echoed through the rough wind, followed by another, then another. The sounds were unmistakable. They were gunshots. He drew his pistol and hurried towards the source of the noise. I watched as he slowly disappeared from my field of vision. A white void had completely swallowed him. For a few minutes, I stared ahead in shock, expecting the policeman to return at any moment, but he didn't. In my car, a small pile of snow had accumulated, so I quickly rolled up the window. I could hear another muffled gunshot joining the already dominant shots. It sounded like they were emptying their magazines completely on everything or everyone. Then the sounds fell silent in perfect unity. The silence weighed heavily on me as I sat in anticipation. My head was full of thoughts and ideas, but the prevailing feeling that occupied my body was a creeping sense of fear. What the hell was going on here? In a moment of weakness, I looked over at the bottle of liquor on the floor again. I hadn't gone without a drink for so long in years. A sip wouldn't hurt, would it? Just to calm my nerves. If I was discreet enough, the officers wouldn't notice anything. Just as I leaned over to the passenger side to pick up the bottle, my vehicle shook violently. Something massive had crashed into my car. I swore loudly and sat up straight again, leaving the bottle behind. Immediately, I desperately searched for clues about the perpetrator. I looked in the rearview mirror, through the side window, and even through the passenger side window. Nothing but a flood of white spots. Then I noticed something in the snowstorm ahead of me. A black silhouette grew larger and larger, and soon I could see what it was. A man. No, 2 men, and they were running towards my car. But these guys were neither police officers nor paramedics who had arrived earlier. They had to be the occupants of the cars in front of me. And then 2 more people appeared behind them, either chasing the 2 men in front or following them. As they got closer, I could clearly see the expressions etched into their faces. They were frightened. They looked like they had seen a ghost. The first 2 men ran past my car. They didn't even look at me. Shortly thereafter, the 2 people behind them followed, a woman and a boy. They hurried across the ice at great speed, while simultaneously being careful not to slip and fall. Before I could react, they were gone, once again swallowed by the endless white void. That was definitely a cause for concern. Who, in their right mind, would give up the comforts of their vehicle out here in this weather? The driver in front of me carefully opened one of the car doors. A middle-aged white man with a beer belly stepped out into the cold. He wrapped his down jacket around his shoulders and stared into the distance. I watched him curiously and wondered if he would also start running. and then I wondered if I should join him, in case he actually decided to. At the moment, it seemed illogical, but on the other hand, these guys clearly knew something I didn't. Maybe there was a gas leak before us. Maybe radioactive material was improperly disposed of. My mind raced, searching for logical explanations for my current predicament, but I found none. The man took a few steps forward and carefully inspected the snowstorm before him. It seemed as if something had caught his attention. He took a few more steps and stood in front of his car, partially blocking my view of him. His left side was still visible though, but there was something else. In the deep ravines of the snowstorm, something was moving. I strained my eyes, leaned forward in my seat, and stared through my snow-covered windshield. From the left side of the road, a large silhouette approached on the opposite lane and slowly moved towards the man. Although she was far away, she seemed twice as big as him. The man was far too busy examining what had caught his attention right in front of him. An overwhelming sense of fear filled my veins. The way the silhouette moved, I couldn't quite explain why, but it felt predatory, like a lion stalking its prey through the dense underbrush of the African savanna, just before it pounces and secures a fresh meal. Was it a moose? It didn't look like that. The proportions were completely off, and it almost looked like it was walking on two legs. But I couldn't think of any other large animal that the silhouette out here could belong to. I doubted that there had ever been polar bears in this area, and even if there had, they couldn't possibly reach this size. Or it was as if my primal instincts were begging me to do something. I felt my fight instinct kicking in before the flight reflex, but I managed to keep it under control. In my warm SUV, I was safe. But the man, anyway, I had to warn him somehow. If I honked, what was chasing him could have immediately sprung into action. But before I could think of anything, the man screamed in fear. Dampened by the thick outer wall of my car, his screams echoed. I focused on what lay ahead of me and tried to catch a glimpse of what had upset him so much. He turned around and tried to flee. He had almost made it to the driver's door of his car when he fell face first onto the cold, hard ground. He must have slipped. The predatory silhouette to his left was nowhere to be seen now. For a brief moment, I looked the man in the eyes. A familiar expression of fear appeared on his face. He dug his long and unkempt nails into the snow and crawled slowly forward. Then he screamed again, but this time not out of fear, but out of pain. Horrified, I watched as the man tried to resist and clung to the powdery snow as if it would actually provide a stable grip. He was dragged in front of his car and out of my sight. Just before he turned the corner, I could see his blood-soaked hands desperately clinging to the tires, and then he was pulled away. I just couldn't believe it. It was like a scene from a horror movie, only this was real. That actually happened. The man's wailing abruptly stopped, and apart from the harsh winds of the snowstorm, there was no sound to be heard. I took out my phone and did my best to suppress the trembling in my hands as I dialed emergency services. As I waited for a response, I made sure all the doors were locked while I fixed my gaze on the spot where I had last seen the man. A few long imprints in the snow testified to the spot where he had lain, and a red handprint stained the black rubber of the front tire. Come on, pick up already," I muttered gruffly into my phone. But I never got past the dial tone. Was it because I had no reception? I heard that many emergency numbers work despite poor reception, but at that moment, I was inclined to believe the opposite. Finally, I gave up and hung up. I huddled in my seat and made myself as small as possible. At this point, I can't even tell you how long I sat there waiting. The concept of time felt irrelevant in that moment. In my reclined position, I still had a good view of the outside world. There were no signs of movement, just a blank white canvas. I couldn't hear any recognizable sounds either. Then I watched in slow motion as each individual snowflake landed and melted on the glass. The windshield wipers fought vigorously against the snowstorm, wiping away everything the malevolent storm had to offer. Then suddenly, with a dull thud, something heavy crashed onto the windshield, and the wipers smeared a viscous, red liquid back and forth across the glass. An almost indescribable feeling of living horror pierced my soul as I realized what I was seeing. I immediately recognized the sad eyes and the distorted expression of pain that spread across the poor man's face. Glistening red blood had completely stained his hair, and the man's skin was full of cuts and cracks. But the true horror of this scene did not lie in the terrible sight that greeted me just 10 inches away, separated only by a broken glass pane. No, the true horror revealed itself after I finally mustered the courage to ponder the question I wasn't even sure I wanted the answer to. Where was the rest of him? When I realized I was staring at a freshly decapitated human head, I was forced to scream uncontrollably at the top of my lungs. And I did. I couldn't do anything about it. I felt nauseous and was on the verge of vomiting. I needed all my strength to maintain the flicker of composure that had not yet left my body, and I quickly sat down in my seat while frantically scanning my surroundings. However, I saw nothing but a heavy snowstorm. I tried to calm myself down, knowing that panic would only make the situation worse. Then I calmed my breathing and remained still. I slowly counted backwards from 10. The grotesque sight that greeted me when I looked through the windshield, however, was not exactly helpful. So I closed my eyes and continued counting, focusing on controlling my breathing. But even when I closed my eyes, I still saw his face. The cruel image had burned itself deep into my memory, and I was afraid at the thought that I might never sleep peacefully again. In my distraction, I did not notice that something foreign filled the air, something ominous. It was a deep sound, barely audible, a stark contrast to the roaring winds outside. It was the kind of sound that you feel more than hear, if that makes sense. It was deep and flowing, and I swear I could feel my chest vibrating slightly like when you're at a concert or in a nightclub with a really loud bass. Carefully, I rolled my window down a crack to hear the strange noise better. Now it was much clearer, and it could best be described as a kind of deep rumble. The tone fluctuated slightly, as if it were synchronized with short, quick breaths. It would be quite an impressive feat of the vocal cords if the sound were of organic origin. I tried my best to determine the direction from which the sound was coming, but I found the task nearly impossible. It could be that the wind distorted and shifted the sound, but it sounded as if it were coming from all directions. I didn't know what to do. Of course, I didn't want to get out of the car and run away like the drivers before me, but I felt that I would be an easy target in the car. I also had no weapons to defend myself, not even a pocket knife in the glove compartment. The only thing I had was an old Zippo lighter, which I doubted would really cause any damage in a fight. The deep rumbling subsided and was replaced by a howling noise reminiscent of an owl, only much deeper, as if someone were blowing air into a hollow tree trunk. But this sound was easy to locate, and I could tell it was coming from behind the car in front of me, where I had last seen the man before his untimely death. I directed my gaze to the source of the noise and expected to see the owner any moment, stepping around the edges of the vehicle. Later, I suddenly heard another identical, deep howl from my left side. I wondered how the animal or creature, or whatever it was that made those sounds, had somehow managed to sneak past my field of vision and position itself to my left without me noticing. But my astonishment was interrupted as the original calls from the front pierced through the winter air again, as if they were an answer to the others. To my utter dismay, I slowly realized that whatever was making those sounds, whatever had killed that man, was not alone out here. Then I saw for the first time, as if on cue, I noticed the dominant silhouette standing in the middle of the road, standing out against the howling snowstorm. Slowly, the creature emerged from the terrible snowstorm, just a few meters from the car ahead, and revealed itself. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, a despicable middle finger to all of God's creatures on this earth. Its skull resembled that of a crocodile and was well 3 meters above the ground. It also had a large crest attached directly above its eyes, reminiscent of a bull's horns. His razor-sharp teeth were stained red, and blood dripped from his mouth onto the snow-covered asphalt. The entire creature was covered in dense white fur, like that of a polar bear. No wonder I hadn't seen it until now. It was perfectly camouflaged in the powdery white snow. The rest of the body was hard to make out due to the storm, but I could see that it was huge and easily towered over the vehicle it was slowly approaching. It came closer and trudged towards me at an uneven pace. Blood was still dripping from its disfigured mouth. It almost looked like it was smiling, almost. I looked around the driver's cabin and desperately searched for something I could use to defend myself. Except for the bottle of schnapps that I had lying around, nothing came to mind. Well, at least I could dull the pain of being torn apart if I had some alcohol in my blood, I thought to myself. Since the creature was uncomfortably close to me, I simply tried to drive away. What the policeman had said earlier was true. The road was extremely narrow, but in the face of certain death, I thought it was worth a try. However, since I was trapped by a car in front of me and one behind me, I had to execute a difficult maneuver to escape. A maneuver I wasn't sure I could pull off under these dangerous conditions. But I had to try. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down, and the tires spun in the snow, scattering debris everywhere. In that moment, I remained still and pressed the pedal even harder, hoping that I could free myself from my frozen captivity. In my panic, I looked ahead and stared into the creature's eyes. I could feel its evil gaze drilling deep into my soul. The wheels kept turning, but I couldn't move forward. I had waited too long. It was just as I had feared. I was trapped. I couldn't go anywhere. A deafening scream echoed just a few meters away, and I saw that the creature had stopped. It lifted its head and let out another scream. "What the hell do you want?" I shouted and hit the steering wheel in frustration. The wretched thing tilted its head and made another sound. It was as if it wanted to get my attention or distract me. Before I knew it, I felt a burning pain throughout my entire body, and my world fell apart as a massive force crashed into the left side of the car and sent it flying into the air. The SUV rolled over, accompanied by the sound of metal crunching. Fortunately, I had my seatbelt on, otherwise, I would have probably broken my neck while spinning around in the car like dirty laundry in a washing machine. When the car finally came to a stop, I was hanging upside down in the driver's seat. The vehicle had rolled into the nearby roadside ditch. Beneath me, on the inside of the car roof, lay shards of glass and piles of snow. I hadn't quite processed what had happened yet, so I sat there for a moment and took it all in. Suddenly, everything felt so calm and quiet. I wondered if I had even survived the ordeal. A warm liquid flowed from my chin into my mouth, and then over my entire face. The sharp metallic taste snapped me out of my trance, and I began to assess the situation. Outside, I heard heavy footsteps quickly approaching the vehicle. Each powerful step struck rhythmically in the snow, and I could imagine the creature's mouth frothing at the prospect of a fresh, new meal. The footsteps suddenly stopped right in front of the driver's side window, and I turned my head to see better. A pair of large and powerful hind legs stood just a few inches from my face. They were covered in scales that looked like those of reptiles and were covered in dense, white fur. The creature had 3 long claws protruding from each foot. The deafening scraping of metal filled the air as I imagined the creature beginning to scratch at the underside of the SUV. Through the rapid back and forth sliding of the monster's feet, I began to understand the sheer ferocity of the attack. It became increasingly wild and shredded the outer skin at an incredibly high speed. A combination of screams and growls escaped its bloodthirsty jaws as it ground the metal down. It wouldn't be long now until it was through. Another pair of heavy footsteps stopped just a short distance away, on the opposite side of the car. Directly in front of the passenger side window, this creature, like its predecessor, began to scratch and kick at the car's body. The two creatures were relentless. I had never seen anything like it. Not even wild hyenas were so starved. At that moment, I prepared for the impact, unbuckling my seatbelt and positioning myself so that I wouldn't break my neck upon impact. I hit the ground hard and was greeted by the sensation of cold snow and broken glass. The car rocked back and forth as the creatures attacked it fiercely. It was obvious that I couldn't stay in here much longer, but it also didn't seem wise to escape from the crushed remains of my vehicle and flee on foot. I felt a deep despair rising within me as I realized that I would most likely not survive another day. That was it after all. Just as all hope had vanished, and I began to accept my fate, a cold and elongated object brushed against my arm. I turned around to see what it was, and when I saw the still intact bottle with the alcohol being placed on the ground, it dawned on me. My hands trembled as I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my old Zippo lighter. I examined the Jack Daniels and estimated that the contents wouldn't be enough for the strong reaction I was hoping for. So I opened the glove compartment and began to search. "Oh, there it is," I exclaimed again as my fingers brushed over the bottle of perfumed hand sanitizer, a relic from the pandemic. It was also almost full. I opened the two bottles and began pouring the disinfectant alcohol into the half-empty whiskey bottle. The disinfectant, mixed with the strong bourbon, would certainly be enough for an improvised Molotov cocktail. I tore a piece of cloth from my shirt and stuffed it into the bottleneck. With the Molotov cocktail in hand, I crawled towards the shattered windshield. I turned around and pressed my feet against the shattered glass frame. In a state where my adrenaline levels shot up, I pressed my legs down and applied pressure to the windshield. I strained and pushed my legs harder than ever before in my life, wishing I had spent more time in the gym beforehand. Due to the severely damaged condition, it didn't take long for the windshield to come loose, and the rough wind swirling outside filled the passenger compartment of the overturned car. Above me, the creatures growled and roared, kicking and tugging at the bodywork. I could see narrow strips of light penetrating the underside of the car, which meant they were almost through. I crawled through the new opening into the merciless snowstorm. Afterwards, I feared that one of the creatures would immediately shove my head into its mouth as soon as I stepped outside, and I would be done for. But that never happened. It seemed as if they were too busy trying to get through the hard exterior of the SUV, and they hadn't noticed that I had made my cunning escape. I crawled through the snow, praying to God that the beasts wouldn't turn their hideous heads and discover the easy prey sliding right beside them. At that moment, I also didn't dare to turn around. I couldn't bring myself to look the disgusting creatures in the face. When I had reached a sufficient distance from the car, I finally turned around and stood up. I lit my lighter and set the Molotov cocktail on fire. By the way, you shouldn't try this at home. With all my remaining strength, I hurled the burning bottle onto the scrap heap that had once been my car and watched with satisfaction as the fire flared up. I even believe that I hit one of the creatures, for I heard a startled yelp. The flames were nowhere near big enough to trigger a massive explosion or anything like that, but they were enough to distract the creatures, allowing me to make my escape. I ran back onto the street and continued past all the abandoned cars that were further up. The ice was stained red, and a few human corpses, or at least what was left of them, were lined up around the various abandoned vehicles. Finally, I passed the ambulance and the police car that had arrived about an hour earlier. There were no signs of the police officer who had spoken to me, but deep down, I knew what fate had befallen him. In the distance, I heard ominous growls from one of the creatures, followed by excited screams. Had they finally noticed that I was gone? In this case, I didn't have much time. I got into the ambulance and settled into the driver's seat. A frozen and severed human hand hung from the steering wheel. I gagged as I tore it off and threw it out the open window. The shrill screams of the creature echoed through the snowstorm, and it sounded as if they were getting closer. Desperately, I turned the ignition key of the ambulance, and to my delight, it started without any problems. I floored the gas pedal and drove off at full speed. Fortunately, ambulances in this area are well equipped to handle dangerous terrain and snow-covered roads. During the drive, I watched the rearview mirror attentively, hoping to catch a final glimpse of one of the monsters. But the only thing I saw were swirling snowflakes, effortlessly dancing on the icy winds that carried them. After about 30 minutes of driving, I arrived in a small town. The snowstorm had eased, and the sun was setting on the horizon. I parked in front of the first roadside hotel I found, and I must have looked like a zombie when the receptionist desperately asked me to alert the authorities. She looked very nervous, but did what I told her. After a while of conversation, the friendly receptionist informed me that the police would come by first thing tomorrow morning. Apparently, the nearest police station was an hour's drive away, and the raging storm had caused major infrastructure problems throughout the entire state. Since no one was in immediate danger, they would wait until the roads were cleared and safe to travel again. I was not satisfied with this answer, but I was too tired to really care. Then I checked into one of the hotel rooms and started typing everything on my phone. There are still so many questions unanswered, but I assume there will be more news about the situation tomorrow. I just hope that the other drivers on this highway made it out okay, but I have my doubts. The snowstorm had subsided by now, and from my second-floor window, I had a view of the clear night sky and the endless expanse. I admit, this landscape is beautiful, but it's a shame that I will forever associate the tranquility of the snowfall with the abominable horror of the events that preceded it. But that's not all. Since it got hot in my room, I decided to open my window a crack. For an hour now, I have been listening to the wind sweeping over the frozen landscape. Strangely, there are no sounds of wild animals out here, but there is something else. Occasionally, the silence in the distance is interrupted by the all-too-familiar and ominous sound of a faint scream echoing into the night.